Hello, and welcome to the Rhodes Climate Leadership Series, with current Rhodes Scholars interviewing Rhodes alumni about their work in the climate space. My name is Claire Wang. I'm a 2019 Rhodes Scholar from the United States, and I focus on climate and energy policy. And I'll turn it over to Grace to introduce herself.
My name's Grace Henry. I'm a 2020 Rhodes Scholar from Australia, currently studying a Master of Energy Systems and passionate about energy policy.
Excellent. We are delighted to have Dr. Katharine Wilkinson joining us today. Katharine is an author, strategist, and teacher working to heal the planet that we call home. She is a Rhodes Scholar and graduated from Oxford with a doctorate in geography and the environment. So thank you for joining us, Katharine.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for doing this series. Thanks for having me.
No, thank you for joining. So Katharine, you're the author of 4 books, a co-host of a podcast, a frequent public speaker, and you delivered a TED Talk which has over 1.9 million views. Tell us what drew you to the space of climate communication.
So I think for a long time, I have been really interested in the stories that we tell about ourselves and about our relationship with this planet, right, that we all call home. And that was really an interest that birthed in high school. When I was 16, I spent a semester living in the woods with 25 other kids in Western North Carolina. And it's when I started reading the work of Mary Oliver. I read Daniel Quinn's kind of seminal book, Ishmael, and started to ask those questions, right, about how the stories that we tell set the framework for our sense of responsibility or lack thereof, our sense of connection or lack thereof, to the living systems of the planet, to one another. And so those seeds, I think I carried with me in various ways for a long time. And then I had a year in between undergrad and coming to Oxford, and I worked for a big environmental NGO called the Natural Resources Defense Council, which is headquartered in New York, but I was spending most of my time in Tennessee with rural county mayors, with the governor's office. And I was just really struck by how very much kind of the mainstream kind of big green environmental movement just speaks right past most of America. Even people who really care about land, who care about place. And that was in the midst of the second term of the Bush administration. So there was also already this sort of deep partisan fissure around environmental issues and specifically climate. And so I was kind of grappling with these questions around political will and public engagement and how do we reach people. And that year, an initiative called the Evangelical Climate Initiative was launched. And it was a group of very high profile evangelical Christian leaders in the US who came out with a full page ad in the New York Times, and in Christianity Today, I saw the Times ad that said, "Our commitment to Jesus Christ compels us to solve the global warming crisis." And I was like, where did this come from? What is this, right? This runs very counter to, certainly the stereotype that I had learned of evangelicals and the Republican Party kind of march in lockstep with one another. But clearly this was a real break from the Bush administration. And I dug a little bit deeper and got quite fascinated by how this sort of narrative and framing was unfolding, as well as kind of the organizing work within that community. And so when I came to Oxford, I knew that I wanted to do research kind of on some aspect of that. And I ended up, focusing on what was at the time kind of this burgeoning climate movement among at least some of American evangelicalism, and specifically looking at that through the lens of discourse and framing and narrative shift. And that was fascinating, and also in some ways frustrating to sort of sit on the academic sidelines, kind of, assessing how other people are doing this. And so fast forward some years after that, it was really exciting for me to then get to do some of that work, right? Like hands in the dirt, shaping the story that we tell, or one of the stories that we tell through the work that I did at Project Drawdown. So yeah, you never know, I guess, what seeds get planted at age 16 that then, come to bear fruit, many years later. But that's kind of a long, it's a bit of a long answer to that question. But I think also at the crux of that is that I think the climate movement historically has failed in a lot of ways to think about the need for cultural change, the need for really artful storytelling that helps us not just see the future that we want to avoid, but to engage our radical imaginations in what is possible. And I think we still have just a ton of work to do to do on that front. So so I think it's really exciting the more and more I hear people in the climate space kind of seeing how critical these tools are, and also, more and more funders being willing to invest in them. It feels like a really exciting time also to be doing this work.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. Thank you for sharing the journey from when you were young, because Claire and I obviously, being in similar shoes to you, but many years ago, it's hard to see the career trajectory that you'll take. How have you seen the engagement with the general public throughout your career? How has that changed along with the communication?
So the polling data is promising. We've had, sort of a slow but pretty steady march, and I'm more familiar with kind of where the research sits on this in the context of the US, but I think it's sort of, we're behind lots of parts of the world, but I think it's sort of the trends are roughly applicable. That we now have a very clear majority of folks who understand that climate change is happening. They're worried about it, and they think that we should be doing more, right, on any number of things, and particularly around clean energy. And that's exciting. And the other thing that kind of the most recent social science tells us as well is that it's more robust, right? Like people are more convicted in where they stand now than they were a few years ago, right? Where you might be sort of seeing people kind of shift spaces between, yeah, I'm concerned, like, I'm kind of ambivalent. Now people it's like a pretty steady state there. And the crowd that, I was certainly thinking a lot about when I was doing my PhD research, which was 2006 to 2009, was the denial camp, right? And that crowd has also very steadily declined. I think the latest numbers from Yale are something like 7% of the American public. They're very loud. They seem very active on Twitter, but they're quite small, right? And I think that's another thing that has really shifted in this space from, like, how do we deal with those people? How do we bring those people along on a journey, to thinking about what do we do with this big population of folks who, are somewhat aware, they're somewhat concerned, but they're on the sidelines, right? How do we welcome them in? How do we really build the biggest and strongest team possible? And I think that piece of welcoming people in and helping them to understand how they can play a role in, this incredible transformation that we have to undertake as a society this decade. And I think still we're giving the average person really like trite and consumerist recommendations on what they can do, right? Like it's still way too much on individual behavior change and not enough on collective action. And so that means there's also still too much of this sense of like shame and guilt and, somebody's going to tell me I have to eat a veggie burger and like all of that stuff, which I think is, it sounds silly, but I think it's a very real detriment to the inclusiveness of the movement, right? Like I don't want people obsessing about kind of what they're getting wrong in their individual life. I want us thinking about how powerful we can be together. And I think there's really exciting narrative shift that's happening there too. And of course, the youth climate movement has had a lot to do with shaping that and helping that get traction. And shaping also the narrative that we can be multi-solving for the near-term needs that people and communities are facing and solve for this long-term diffuse global challenge at the same time. And that when we do that, it's more effective, right? And that's another way, I think, of welcoming people in that's really critical.
I really appreciated what you said about the evolution of narratives now in the climate space to be really emphasizing putting communities first and addressing structural challenges rather than sort of individual guilt-laden behaviors. It seems like, at least in my experience, there has been a lot of understanding about these necessary changes in messaging and narrative over the past several years, but they haven't always been implemented in practice. So I'm curious if you can talk more about the difficulties of creating a coherent narrative around the climate problem and the climate solution for the entire movement beyond a specific individual or organization.
Yeah, I think it has been a real challenge to get sufficient funding and resourcing for narrative change work, but also for kind of power building organizing work. I think there's been a long-standing bias from not all, but lots of climate funders of kind of wanting to see like, but what are the gigatons, right? What is going to be the measurable impact on emissions? Well, when you're thinking about that, it's going to keep you sort of more constrained, right, to the site of impact in terms of leveraging solutions or policy instruments. But the enabling environment for all of that to happen depends on shifting culture and building power, right? And so there's been, I think, sort of an order of operations issue almost in the climate space that we've been needing to shift the context to help move all of these, kind of move the nitty gritties of solutions forward. And I think that's shifting, but there's still quite a ways to go. I think it's also, we've seen long-standing inequity in terms of who gets access to resources for climate work. Again, I'm most familiar with data about the US, but it's true globally as well, that like the majority of climate funding is going to efforts that are led by white men, and we definitely want them on the team, right? But there's been kind of a, sort of a persistent approach that's like facts without feelings, solutions without justice, sort of a competitiveness that like thwarts good community building and collaboration. And my personal perspective is that those dynamics are not working. And so we have to broaden the tent. And that means we have to shift who has resources to lead the way, right? And who gets to shape the debate about what genuinely is a solution, right? And what we should be expecting from climate action in terms of justice and benefits to communities, as opposed to, sort of what I find very concerning, which are the sort of profiteering narratives around climate solutions. Yes, we've got to figure out how to marshal capital that is now way too concentrated in the hands of way too few people and companies. But I'm not interested in a low emissions future that deepens wealth inequality, because that's not right. That doesn't genuinely get us to a just and livable future. And so I think the need to continue deepening the analysis of why we're in the mess that we're in is really important as well, right? And people bring different lenses to that based on their own experiences. And clearly this is not just a challenge of technology and engineering. There are much bigger things at work. So, and I think the other piece is kind of back to the narrative shaping. Media Matters does a great job tracking how much climate coverage is happening on kind of primetime TV and other outlets, and whose voices are being heard. And again, it is vastly undercovered still in kind of mainstream media. And then the folks who are invited to come be talking heads about these things are mostly white men. I think last year it was roughly like less than a quarter women in primetime climate coverage, and then less than 10% people of color. So that still means, right, that it's not just about money, it's also about who gets platforms, who gets a microphone, right? So all of these things really matter. And that's very much something that's kind of sitting at the core of my work now. How do we shift some of that?
Definitely. One quick follow-up from me, and then I'll turn it over to Grace again. I think it's been really heartening to see how much conversation around climate policy recently has explicitly centered these principles of justice and equity, especially seeing proposals from the Biden-Harris administration and recent legislation that talks about the importance of reinvesting in communities of color that have borne the brunt of pollution for decades, and also not leaving fossil fuel workers in communities behind. I think it's interesting, though, that a lot of these conversations, especially in Western countries, are taking place on a very domestic focus, especially as it ties in with COVID recovery. It's a very strong understanding of within our borders, how is inequity playing out? But there's less of a discussion about these global inequities that are probably much larger in magnitude and likely harder to address. So I'm curious, are you worried about an isolationist trend for climate policy, especially post-COVID? And if so, how should we remedy this to bring the conversation back towards these global inequities?
I think such a great point, Claire. And I think you're right. I think there is sort of an imbalance in terms of kind of aperture, right, for what we're thinking about. And I think part of that in the US is because we are so damn far behind, right? Because we have been, certainly for the last 4 years, but before that as well, right? Basically holding the world hostage in a lot of ways in terms of our absence of climate leadership and action. So I think that's important, right? And it's no small thing that the Biden administration has become a climate administration, right? That did not seem likely when Joe Biden launched his campaign. And I think it speaks to really incredible work by both the kind of policy teams behind other candidates in the race, by the sort of research that informed that, by incredible organizing, by particularly the youth movement and bird dogging organizers and bird dogging candidates, and kind of pushing this sort of race to the top on climate policy. And so I think there are actually potentially some lessons there, right? That if we want to like make sure that we're not having this purely domestic isolationist look, that we need to be working across those leverage points to get, again, thinking about the US, to get the administration to go there. Because it's very clear that, kind of collaborative policy creation, like more meta, kind of like that's working, that good organizing is working. And so, yeah, so I think it's sort of, looking to those strengths within the climate movement right now, and trying to, to ensure that this does not become sort of a navel gazing and an isolationist approach. And I have no idea what to expect from COP26, which I think will also have a lot to do with, like, do we genuinely move into an era of global collaboration? I don't know.
There's many questions, isn't there?
Yeah.
And so maybe taking a step back a bit, we see that a lot of these issues come down to policy. And that's actually the reason why I'm interested in the policy side of things.
Yeah.
But what about just, everyone listening in on this who might not be able to, who might not be working on policy or on that side? What advice do you give? How can you create such change and influence when you don't have that position of authority?
Yeah. So I feel like what's really exciting about this moment is that we basically need every available superpower on climate, right? We need, like, basically, like, whatever you've got, whatever your magic is, like, we need it. Whether that is, design and digital expertise, whether that is research and analysis, whether that is organizational leadership, whether that's grassroots organizing, like, the need is so vast, and every decision-making space on some scale is a climate decision-making space today. And so I think we see a lot of folks trying to kind of now, which is great, like sort of move laterally into the climate space, which is incredibly exciting. But I think there's still too much sense of like, well, I have to stop doing what I've been doing and start doing this, instead of like, actually, how do you bring climate leadership into whatever context you're in, right? And that can be, your neighborhood school, right? And thinking about curriculum and like what's happening in the classroom. That can be, organizing a campaign around bike lanes in your city and tackling things, at a municipal level. Like, it's so vast. It's so open. And I think what we need more of is help for people to think about, like, what are the skills that I have, right? What are my sort of resources and talents that I can tap into? And then what are the needs in the space, and how do we create more Venn diagrams there? And there just, I think, aren't simple answers, which I know is incredibly frustrating to people. When I was working on that TED Talk, one of the TED curators was like, you got to leave people with a simple call to action. And I was like, oh yeah, sure, like a simple call to action on climate change, that makes sense. Like that's totally doable. It's sort of a one and done. You tick the box, everybody's the same. And I tried instead to kind of issue that sort of invitation. And I think this is where, it seems sort of like fuzzy, the way that climate has been in decades past, like so ceded to experts, right? Like if you don't have a PhD and an 800 slide PowerPoint presentation and a speechwriter and you sort of have no business in this conversation. And I think that's changing finally, right? That like the only credential that is needed is to be alive on this planet in this moment, right? And like, if that's you, like we need you and come on in. And I was actually just talking with a kind of a friend and mentor yesterday about a documentary about the first People's Assembly on climate, which happened in the UK, I think maybe a year or two ago. And what a beautiful illustration it is of people stepping into climate leadership for the first time. And taking ownership of not just the challenge, but ownership of designing what the solution should look like and what the future is for, a more climate just world. And that's the kind of thing that I get so excited about, because I think when we have the biggest and strongest team possible, like we will win. But we've got to build the biggest and strongest team possible.
I really love that note. And I absolutely agree in terms of the importance of having everybody on board for the climate movement, not necessarily just as climate activists themselves, but in every profession they have, because ultimately, we all work on climate change because we're all impacted by it and we all contribute to it to a certain extent. And as those climate impacts are becoming more clear, which I think is a lot of the reason why more people are being drawn into working on climate change now, is we're actually feeling the effects already. How are you seeing your work begin to evolve from more mitigation focus to reduce carbon emissions, and then moving towards adaptation to live with the impacts of climate change that we've already built in? How are you strategizing about that, either in terms of the topics that you focus on or the way that you picture the rest of your career evolving?
So I think in some ways it's sort of unfortunate that we, that sort of in the kind of inexpert climate discourse, we landed with the sense that there is mitigation and then there is adaptation. And that I was like, that's what I learned, in graduate school. And then when I started to do the work of bringing the book Drawdown to life and reading what felt like a gajillion things at Mach speed about climate solutions, there are so few mitigation solutions that don't also have adaptation and resilience potential. And so I think part of it is about layering in those priorities, right, as we design for emissions reduction and also supporting carbon sinks, right? That regenerative agriculture is not just carbon rich soil, but it is actually more resilient in terms of a food system, right? Better able to withstand drought and extreme weather. And that's just one very isolated example. But I think, I guess I'm sort of a hopeless interdisciplinarian. And I think a lot of what I have tried to do in terms of my work on climate is to bring a more holistic perspective, that we can't just be thinking about a single sector, right? yes, fossil fuels are like 3/4 or so of the problem, but they're not the whole problem. We have to be thinking about a whole ecosystem of solutions. We've got to be thinking about a whole set of levers for moving solutions forward. We've got to be thinking both about the near term and the long term. And similarly, we have to be thinking both about like how we turn off the spigot of carbon and survive the carbon that we've already put into the atmosphere. And so I hope that we're actually moving towards a more integrated conversation. And there's a line, I wish I could quote it perfectly, from Janie Bavishi's essay in All We Can Save. Janie is the head of resilience for the city of New York. So she's thinking a lot about, New York is a coastal city, right? It has like an incredible amount of coastline. It's very vulnerable. And she's also worked in New Orleans and then in Honolulu before that. So she's had really interesting experiences in some of the places where climate impacts in the US are hitting, first and fast. And she's like, every decision that a city makes at this point has to be an adaptation decision, right? Every piece of infrastructure has to be adaptation infrastructure. And I don't think we're anywhere close to that permeating in the way that it needs to. But I think we have, I think there's a lot of rough road ahead. And I think it's also why we have to be strengthening kind of the human system at the same time that we're strengthening our energy and transportation and building and all these other systems, right? Because we have to take care of each other. And the last essay actually in All We Can Save is by Christine Nieves Rodriguez, who writes about her experience in Hurricane Maria. And realizing in the aftermath of that devastation in Puerto Rico, that community is the most important infrastructure for adaptation and resilience. And the title of her essay is "Community is Our Best Chance." And so I think that I hope we will also see getting increasing traction. And I think the more that we think about this kind of web of collaboration to move solutions forward, we also need to be thinking about this kind of web of care to make sure that that we're taking care of one another along the way, and realizing that and this I think is like, other parts of the world are in better shape on this than the US, right? But that like social safety nets are climate policy. And there's some really exciting work. I don't know if you all are talking with Rihanna Gunwright, but she's doing some very cool research at the moment on kind of the nexus of like a green economy and the care economy. Lots to be done. That was kind of a rambly answer, Claire, to your question.
So much ground to cover.
Yeah.
I'll turn it over to Grace for the next question.
Yeah, thanks, Katharine. So you mentioned the All We Can Save project. Do you want to just explain a little bit about what motivated you to launch that project? Were there any surprises that you found along the way while you were writing your book, and where you hope it can lead to from here?
Yeah, the book in a lot of ways was kind of born out of frustration around, one of the things we've already touched on about who has the microphone, who's shaping the discourse, and then what does that mean for who can get access to resources, et cetera, right? Like, there is, for better or for worse, a connection between like being able to tell your story and then getting that story in front of people who hold the reins of resources, and then getting those resources to the efforts that really need them. And so my co-editor, Ayana Elizabeth Johnson, and I wanted to use this book as kind of, one way to start to tip those scales, and to put into the world not another like single authored, I have all the answers climate book, but a mosaic, right? Kind of almost a kaleidoscope, right? That you can sort of keep turning through the essays, through the poems. There are 60 of them, plus original art by Madeline Jubilee Saito, and see the crisis, see the solutions, see the challenges, see the openings in different ways. And we're hoping now, or we are now kind of carrying forward that work of growing support for, in particular, women's leadership at kind of at the forefront of the movement, and also more specifically feminist leadership at the forefront of the movement. And we're going to do that through some different things, from curricular resources to all we can save circles we've rolled out, community building, and we're thinking through kind of how we can play a role in trying to unlock some access to resources as well. So lots coming. Our vision, or sort of the framework that is guiding all of our work now, is how do we build power and joy? Power being what we need to create transformational change, and joy, frankly, being what we need to keep showing up for the work. And I think the joy side needs a lot more love and attention in the climate space, because the work is hard, right? And most of the time it feels like the boulder's rolling back down the mountain. And the thing that I've found has been so important is having a sense of like partnerships and community to keep going when it feels like, we're just taking on something too big. We're taking on a machine that's too powerful. We need each other in that too.
Yeah, that was actually going to be one of my next questions, because we hadn't quite touched on it, but you did just then, in terms of bringing in the joy side of things. Is how do you manage with climate anxiety and climate grief, particularly for the younger generation who might just see the future is very much doom and gloom? What advice do you give for managing that?
Yeah, I think the first thing is just to say that it's really real, right? To have our eyes open to what is already unfolding, right, on this planet, is like, if that doesn't bring up grief, fear, anxiety, anger, like all of those things, then you're probably not paying attention. So I think the first thing is to sort of normalize that. And I think we know, both from science, from the world's wisdom traditions, that we are deeply and profoundly interconnected with one another and with the living systems of this planet. And so how could we not be that connected and not feel the brokenness, right, in this more kind of personal and emotional way? For me, things that have helped are like making space to feel those feelings, which is not something we do a lot of. I have a really good therapist who is kind of climate aware and plugged in, and there's more and more of those folks out in the world. I'm part of a monthly circle that I've been in for a number of years, that has been just a source of like grounding and nourishment. That's not specifically about climate, but I don't have despite lots of years of doing research on religion, there's not a faith tradition that like I am called to or feel like is like home for me. And so figuring out how to kind of take care of my like spiritual well-being took me a long time. And that's been a piece of it. And also being, I live in Atlanta, I live in the city, but trying to actually be in nature for me. Like I love mountains. That's where my soul wants to be, like with moss and ferns and yeah. So trying to just actually, feel connected to the life force that is the truest and most persistent thing on this planet, right? That like life wants to keep creating more life. And I think our work is to be participants in that. And so like viscerally feeling that, right? Spring is springing in Atlanta. And it's like, you feel that sense, right? Of life just wanting to barrel forward, and continue to unfurl. And that helps me to actually feel small in a really helpful way. Right? That this is something that is so much bigger than we are, and it is bigger than the forces of destruction that are currently at work as well.
So many thoughts and feelings and reflections out of that very well put together answer. I'll just ask one follow-up question. Has there been any point in your work where you felt like you couldn't go on, or you felt like giving up? And if so, what gave you the strength and resolve to push through that?
Yeah. I actually found that doing a DPhil was not the most energizing experience on the planet. And I happened to, I now know that like, I really don't like to work alone. I really love to work in partnership. And I think like a collaborative DPhil is a great idea that someone should open the way for. But I also was finishing that work back in 2009. I was like in the furious, like writing stage. And, it looked like we had the best chance in a generation to pass federal climate policy in the US, right? Obama's in office, like Congress, we've got, Democrats have majorities in Congress, and that failed. International negotiations in Copenhagen fell apart. And the climate space to me felt really bureaucratic, technocratic, and bro. And I couldn't see myself in it. I was like, there's not another academic project that's calling to me. So I'm not going to go down that path. And I don't want to go bang my head against a wall for my entire career, going back to somewhere like NRDC. And I sort of made a detour that I had not expected, and I'm not sure that I would do it again. But that was a moment when it was like, okay, if we can't move things at the federal level, like cities and businesses are places where, quick movement is possible. And I didn't know a damn thing about business. But I had been inspired by folks like Ray Anderson, who was the founder and longtime CEO of a carpet tile manufacturer called Interface, which has been one of like the pioneers on first, how do you get to like zero environmental impact as a company? And then now their work is on like, what does it mean to do sort of net planetary good as a company? And so I spent some years in the business world, and I found that an incredibly frustrating and not nourishing place to be. And I always sort of hightailed it out of there. But much of that time, even though I sort of went there wanting to understand, you know, a sector and approaches that I thought could be useful for climate action, I basically didn't touch climate for most of that time. And I had done the work to turn my DPhil research into a book, Between God and Green. And yeah, and then I kind of felt like this, maybe climate's like not the space for me. Maybe there's not a place here that feels like there's a fit between kind of how I want to show up in the world, and the work that needs doing, or the work that people are willing to pay people to do. But it kept tugging, you know, and actually then in a very weird and full circle moment, Interface became a client of mine. And that is actually how I connected with Project Drawdown, and a door opened that I couldn't have gone looking for if I'd wanted it, you know? And I feel like I have a lot more like grace with myself now for like the zigs and zags and the things that turned out to be dead ends, certainly than I did when I was leaving Oxford. Like I had a real misperception that I would either make the right choice or I would make the wrong choice, right? And I think if I could do anything over, it would be to center collaboration at like the heart of my decision making sooner. Ayana is like the best partner I could ever ask for. Like so much so that it makes me like teary-eyed. And like nobody tells you that, right? Everybody says like, figure out, you know, the discipline you want to be in and the skill set you want to have, and you know, and it's like actually just the people you're going to work the most intimately with. That's really what matters. And that I think is where you also like create like fertile soil for emergence, and for like being able to grow your work in response to a landscape that is just shifting all the time. Don't go it alone. I think that's true on the climate, like grief and anxiety. It's true on the work side. Just don't go it alone.
I think that's a great bit to leave it there. Don't go it alone. This has been incredibly insightful, Katharine, and we really have to thank you for your time. I'm so glad that you're working in this communication space, because you have so much knowledge and passion to share with the rest of the world. And I think the more we hear from you, the more change that we can see. Claire, over to you.
Seconded on all of the above. This is such a great conversation. I just wish we had more time, both for this conversation and I guess for general climate action as well. But thank you for all of the brilliant insights and inspirations that you brought with us today. There will be many, many more conversations like this in the Rhodes Climate Leadership Series. So definitely check back on the Rhodes Trust YouTube channel to hear more wonderful conversations with wonderful people. And I think with that, we'll wrap up. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry. Yes,
Katharine.
Katharine.
No, I just wanted to say thank you so much. This was really wonderful. I so appreciate. There's an enormous amount of thought and planning that goes into good questions. So thank you. Thank you for those, and just for a really generative conversation.
Thank you so much.